where and how should you start reading Gene Wolfe? This I think is maybe a slightly less discussed topic. There are maybe a fewer recommendations out there than the in-depth discussions once you're actually into talking about the mysteries of Gene Wolfe novels. And I think that's natural because Gene Wolfe, basically, if you read him and like him, what happens is you're like, I need to know all the mysteries. I need to get into all the stuff. I need to kind of really work out who's the first Severian. And anyway, who is, who's VRT, all this kind of stuff, and what really happened with Severian and Jolenta, that sort of thing. Like, okay, you really get into these mysteries, you really want to know this stuff, and that's natural. But you have to read a Gene Wolfe book, and here I'm afraid I must say, sed contra to the worthies of the field, to the great quote: "You can't read a Gene Wolfe book, you can only reread a Gene Wolfe book." Of course, actually, you have to read it first. And you can get a lot of pleasure out of reading a book without rereading a Gene Wolfe book. They're very pleasurable books. They're not books that are simply impossible to get into, even if a lot of the value, a lot of the fun is really digging deep into these dense archives of symbols and mysteries. So what I want to talk about today is where to start and how to start. So I'm going to go through some books. I make it 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 options, 8 places you could start reading Wolfe's books. I've read a bit over half of his novels, less of that of his short stories, which are more prolific, but I've read most of the big short stories, or many, probably a majority of the big short stories that are important. So I'm not as expert as some people out there, and you will find other opinions, but this is my take as someone who's read a good amount of Wolfe. He wrote 30 novels or whatever, so he had a 36, I think, so he had a big oeuvre, and a bit of guidance is helpful. So basically, here's the thing, is that there's a lot of Gene Wolfe books, and there are some simple starting points. There's some more complicated stuff that maybe is less good to start with. There's some stranger stuff, some stuff that is maybe just a bit more left field, and there's some stuff that some people would feel is weaker. So with that in mind, where should you start? An obvious place, common recommendation, is with some of his short stories. Here, this is The Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories and Other Stories. This is the collection I've got with those stories in them. Basically, The Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories is the first of his so-called archipelago series of short stories. There are 3, there's a trilogy, and then he wrote a 4th as a bit of a tribute to himself. That's I don't know if I actually have that one in a collection. I haven't read it. I've read the main trilogy of short stories, which are The Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories, The Death of Dr. Island, and The Doctor of Death Island. And the most famous of those is The Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories, which is a story about a kid who's reading pulp stories, and they seem to start coming to life. And yeah, that's a great story. I make it 15 pages in this edition to show you the rough text size of that, so you can get a grasp of what that looks like. It's short. If you really want to just think, I cannot commit to a novel of this guy who I hear is really weird and really difficult, in that case, what I recommend is read 15 pages. You might be able to find it free online. I think it is free online somewhere. But read The Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories, and then read some other short stories of his as well. So The Death of Dr. Island, The Doctor of Death Island, that's the trilogy. And there's lots of other well-loved short stories. There's a few other collections out there as well. This is maybe a good place to start, though. So that's an easy place to start. And a cheap, in terms of your time, cheap place to start as well. The first Wolfe novel I read, which I loved it. I didn't read any more Gene Wolfe. I knew him from having written a good introduction to a David Drake collection. Other than that, I only read this book for many years. I don't know, something like 6 or 7 years. I didn't read another Wolfe book. But then I read The Fifth Head of Cerberus. This is 3 novellas which were then stitched up, but they're 3 connected novellas. They're not sort of one of those, okay, they're sort of related, and I've added a weird connection between 1 and 2 that looks dodgy, like some of the great pulp authors did, bless them, honour their memory. But here, this is 3 novellas that are put next to each other, which gradually, they're all different sub-genres of sci-fi. It is sci-fi. The first is a first-person narrative of this guy talking about his upbringing and some of the key events of his early adulthood on a planet called, there's a dual planets, basically Santan and San Croix, and growing up on one of these planets, and he he explains this weird sci-fi world we're in. It's not super weird. Lots of it seems recognizable, but it's also got a big emphasis on cloning and on artificial intelligence, preservation of human intelligence, and you hear about these natives as well, who were here and who maybe were shapeshifters, disappeared, maybe not. The second is a myth, seemingly of the shapeshifting natives, and the third is a prison, a military officer looking through prison records and the audio recordings of interrogations of someone who comes up in the first story. And so, there we go. That's what they are. It is a short book. It is 220 pages thereabouts in this edition, in the SF Masterworks edition. And it was Wolfe's breakout. It's his second novel. The first is generally speaking not considered worth reading. It's a curiosity, not terrible, but not good. And The Fifth Head of Cerberus is really his breakout. And it is is it his third or is it his second? I think it's his second, and then Devil in the Forest. Correct me in the comments. I make it his second via the list I've got here. It's easy to read. It's beautifully written. Wolfe's writing probably never gets better than some of his writing in the 70s in terms of its style. His style is always very good, and it does evolve, and there are different things that are good later on, but it never gets better than here, pretty much. And one thing that's good about Fifth Head of Cerberus is when I first read it, I felt like I got some of the things. Well, obviously, there are mysteries there, and I was like, oh wow, there's some weird things going on here. But they are just open enough to the reader to get them on a first read without reading stuff online. I say that because I did that, and I say that because with my book group, when we read it on Discord, several of them were like, oh okay, this seems like a thing that's going on, without researching it. So Fifth Head of Cerberus I definitely recommend as a good place to start if you want that kind of experience. Maybe I actually think the most common place I've seen people recommend people start, and I don't fully agree, but I completely understand, is just with the Book of the New Sun, generally regarded as his 4 novels in 2 volumes, generally regarded as his masterpiece. It's the start of his great solar cycle, which is 12 novels and is his most important series. And it's about Severian the Torturer, and he is kind of thrown into this, on this dying Earth. You can see the stars in the daytime, the sun is so dim. The moon has been terraformed. It's a sci-fi world, very disorienting, but it's also very compelling with this character Severian, who is claims to have a perfect memory but seems forgetful. How reliable is he as a narrator? Memory and human identity are also important here, as they are for Wolfe in general, but as in Fifth Head of Cerberus. And this really made his name. If Fifth Head is his breakout, Book of the New Sun made his name. It is very baroque, highly stylized. It's a denser read than Fifth Head. It was the Shadow of the Torture was the second Wolfe novel I read. So there's some degree to which I came in semi-fresh because I hadn't read any Wolfe for a long time, and I loved it. And I didn't find it impossible. I think the mysteries are tougher and denser. They're deeper. I think, and especially when you consider the whole solar cycle and what's going on there, and there are many wildly divergent theories about what even is the timelines and the kind of identities of key characters. But no, I love Book of the New Sun. I think, and I think it's, if you're like, look, I'm okay with basically literary fiction. I'm okay with dense literary fiction. And I want to really get into the stuff that people see as his core works. Fifth Head is that, but New Sun is where to start. I think if you're wanting something maybe a bit gentler, New Sun is tougher than some things. Maybe slightly easier are its demi-calls, let's call them. The Book of the Long Sun, again 4 novels in 2 volumes with these beautiful covers. And these, you do not have to read Book of the New Sun first. These are the second set of novels in the solar cycle, but you do not have to read these first. Read these second. You can read either these or New Sun first. I read New Sun, then Long Sun, then Earth of the New Sun, which is the coda to Book of the New Sun. Don't read that first. And then Book of the Short Sun, which is both is shorter actually than some of his stuff, but it's denser and it relies really, it benefits, not relies, benefits heavily on knowledge from the previous 9 novels. So don't start there either. But you could start here, and the great thing about the Book of the Long Sun is it has an amiable, attractive, and at first relatively easy narrator compared to Severian in some ways. Patras Silk, he's a priest. He's on this what is obviously not a normal world, and it's very hot. And he lives in this one city, and there are other cities, and there are gods who appear through, almost like pantheonic gods who appear to the faithful in their manteons via electronic screens and things like that. There's some sense of it's both. It's not very much like Baslag by China Mieville, but there's a tiny bit of that kind of like mixture of, in this case, late Renaissance, early modern civilization with sci-fi, and it's obviously sci-fi. Yes, Silk is a great narrator. It's one thing people run into with this is there is much less obvious direct narrated action than in New Sun, albeit New Sun sometimes, because Wolfe is tricks like this. He literally ends volumes in New Sun and in Long Sun on an event that you then get described in retrospect in the next book. You don't actually see the event, because a big thing for Wolfe is narrative voice. But these are less action-packed, basically, than New Sun. They are more like extended dramatic dialogues, stage dialogues, which are beautifully written. There is a change in style here. He goes for a more compact style, but it works very well. But it does mean that you've got even more information per page. I would recommend Knights of the Long Sun, which is also one of the more action-packed books in the series, as a starting place. So Shadow of the Torturer is the New Sun starter, Knights of the Long Sun is the Long Sun starter. But you're going to get a different experience, both in ways that might be attractive to you and unattractive to you compared to New Sun. Next, we'll go for this on my pile. Wizard Knight, often also recommended as a starting place, it's fantasy. It's about a boy called Abel who seems to be transported from our world, seemingly, into a fantasy world, and there's giants and knights and witches and dragons. And essentially it is about him, as Wolfe is generally writing, not always, but he's generally writing about the road to virtue and about flawed or difficult, complex heroes taking up a role and becoming. There's an interesting quote where of Severian, the hero of Book of the New Sun, Wolfe was asked, so is he Christ? Is he a Christ figure in the book? And he may be in a tropic sense a Christ figure, but Wolfe correctly answered, no, he's not a Christ figure. He's not Christ, but he is a Christian. What Wolfe meant there was, he was talking about, because he talks about this idea that he's a man who's trying to become better. There's this path to virtue, I think Anne Wolfe as a Catholic was thinking in those terms. And Abel in the Wizard Knight is very much, it's physically depicted like that. There's a universe, you get a map at the start of the book. There's a fantasy world with layers of essentially excellence, almost but not quite. It is not actually quite heaven to hell, but it is perhaps heaven to something. You've got these 7 worlds: Niflheim, Muspel, Elfrica, Mythgatha, Sky, Kleos, and Elysion. And you meet creatures and people from all over these. And Abel is there's an interesting thing. His narrative voice is very distinct, very different from others. He's a kid who's ended up basically becoming an adult knight, and he's got to. It's like the film Big, right? He's Tom Hanks, what is, I think, great and attractive about here is it's fantasy. So even though there are fantastic elements elsewhere, this is fantasy, and it's more approachable and easy for some people. Therefore, I think narratively it's fairly straightforward. By that I mean, in terms of linear narrative, you tend to know where you're ending up. I think it's not. It's in the denser style that starts to come in from Long Sun onwards, and so it's maybe less open stylistically than some of the earlier works. And I think there are some kind of complexities and mysteries which are impenetrable at first glance. That's not a problem, that's part of the fun, but we're talking about introductions. So I think here it's got action, it's got chivalry, it's got a kind of wonderful story of ascension in virtue, and it's fantasy. It may be less open than, say, particularly Fifth Head, I've said, or the short stories, or even New Sun. Peace. This is his third or fourth novel. This one, essentially, one suspects if he'd written more novels like this, you'd think of Wolfe as a literary author before being a sci-fi fantasy author. It is a fantasy book. It's about a guy who is narrating his life, spellbinding, brilliant tour de force of the imagination, the melancholy memoir of olden Dennis Weir, embittered old man living out his last days in a small Midwestern town. The novel reveals a miraculous dimension as the narrative unfolds. This is one, again, some of the mysteries are really semi-open. It's written beautifully. It's a very beautifully written book. Like Fifth Head of Cerberus in his 70s period, Wolfe, probably this is my favourite book of his for writing style. The writing style is quite open as well. There are deep mysteries, but it's not super long. You're not kind of caught up on them. It's 320 pages in my edition. You're not super caught up on them. You're not like, oh, okay, I've got to spend like 700 pages trying to work this out. It's like, oh, just move on. And there are some mysteries which are more open, fairly early on and fairly easily. It's a very different kind of novel to his other. Let's say it's fantasy, I think, is the fairest thing to say. It's very different from his other fantasy novels because of what it's attempting to do and kind of who the main character is. The main character is, like Severian, like Abel, are two good examples, a very complex and layered character who you are going to pick up different opinions on over time in your read. Peace is not long. It has a mystery in it to some degree. By that I mean it is a mystery novel to some degree, as well as having mysteries in it. But it's mostly, there's a degree to which you can go along for the ride with this one, and work the rest of it out afterwards. Finally, I am reading the first of the Latro series, probably his other significant series. He wrote, in terms of series, he wrote the Solar Cycle. I've talked about that a few times, many times on the channel, in fact. But his big series, he wrote the Wizard Knight duology. So that's just two novels that then you get in one big bind up. He wrote the Borrowed Man, duology. Well, it was an ongoing series, but two novels, one of which was published posthumously. Those were his last novels, which I haven't read. I've read okay things about, actually. Some people who don't like some of his other late works do like those. And then his other series is the Latro series. This is the first two. So Latro in the Mist is Soldier in the Mist and Soldier of Arete. And then there's Soldier of Sidon, which he basically, the point was he released these in the 80s, Soldier of Sidon later in the 90s. And so this is in the earlier, richer style. It's very nicely written. I haven't finished it yet, so in a sense, which is, the last big gap in my Wolfian education, I feel like. But it's an enormously fun novel so far. Basically, Latro is a guy, and we find this very early on. He's in ancient Greece, and he's been in the Persian army at Plataea, seemingly. That's how it starts. That's what we're told at the start. I don't know if there's mysteries to be revealed there. But he starts in the Persian army, and he's had a blow on the head, and he forgets everything every day. It's Memento, basically. It's essentially ancient Greek Memento. But he also, maybe because of this, it's not clear, is beginning to have epiphanies, divine epiphanies, and real divine epiphanies. They are actually things that, in the context of the world. There's a very clever thing that Wolfe does, which is that he changes most Greek names into English names. So Thebes is hill, and Egypt is the Riverlands, and Athens is thought, and Lacedaemonia is the silent country, and Sparta is rope. Some of these are actually mistranslations functionally, and they're intentionally so. This is called out in a preface, like a fictional preface of the translators in our day of these ancient scrolls. But the point is that Latro knows these places as these names: Hill, Clay, Advent, Cowland, Boeotia, Good Cattle Island, Euboea, things like that. And essentially, that turns it much more, obviously, it's historical fantasy, but it turns it much more clearly, in a sense, to us, into fantasy. It kind of makes it strange to us, and therefore enchants it in a way that we might not be enchanted otherwise. And I've enjoyed it greatly so far. The final one I'll mention is that, in terms of his later work, The Sorcerer's House is recommended sometimes, I think correctly, as a place to start Wolfe. It's easy, it's open, it's fun. There's this guy, he's a prisoner, he's released, he goes, he ends up having this house that's kind of been abandoned. There's a bunch of mysteries. It seems to be connected to fairy. Lots of crazy stuff happens, and he's writing this in letters, so it's an interesting and there are a few letters from other people to him as well. And this is an interesting one, partly because of the strongly divergent range of theories about what's basically going on here. So if you want a Wolfe book that has mystery in it, and is in terms of it has a bunch of Wolfian mysteries, this Sorcerer's House is a great one. It's fantasy, which may appeal. I think the point is it's also fairly easy to read, so it's not long. It's under 300 pages. It has easy style comparatively, I think. It's really good fun. The pages turned over for me, as it were. So I think in terms of a later story that is again fantasy, is epistolary, which some people will find enjoyable and exciting, then Sorcerer's House is a good one. Just some not honourable mentions, but just to say a couple of books I've read which I enjoyed by Wolfe, which I haven't recommended, but they're short. So Pandora by Holly Hollander is a mystery novel. It's a murder mystery. And Castle View, which is Arthurian urban fantasy. I enjoyed both of them. Some people don't enjoy them as much. I really did enjoy them, with some critiques and limitations on them. In fact, I think Pandora I wouldn't give any real criticisms to, other than what I'm about to say, is that they are probably not representative of Wolfe. If you read them, Pandora feels like, I think Wolfe chose to write a pastiche of a 60s to 80s teen murder mystery or teen mystery novel, an American mystery novel, but with some weird twists and turns. And it is very fun. It's easy to read. It's quick to read. There's a mystery. There's a Wolfian mystery in it, certainly. But it's probably not representative in terms of some of the big, strong themes. Of all the Wolfe books, it feels the fluffiest. And Castle View is kind of similar. It's, it goes quickly. It maybe has a flaw in terms of how it ends. It's unique in a sense. It's closest rated, I think, to Wizard Knight. It's odd. It's maybe more elliptical and strange than some Wolfe books are, which actually makes it a bit harder to get into. Even though it's easy to read, you end up being maybe like, I don't know what's going on. So I think that's maybe what I'd say is that they are perhaps partly not, Pandora particularly is not super representative of what you're going to get with Wolfe, even though it's fun. And you may feel like, oh, okay, I don't really get what the big deal is. That was nice Nancy Drew. That would maybe be to miss some of the things going on. But Castle View is both a little flawed and actually I think quite a hard book in some ways, despite maybe in other ways being lighter than other Wolfe books. So that's a couple of short books that in some ways feel like okay places to start, but I would probably say don't. So yes, I'd say short story, Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories, or the Fifth Head of Cerberus as a fairly easy open novel starter. The New Sun, Long Sun, Wizard Knight, and they're not bad places to start in terms of they're denser and they're certainly longer, but they're really what you're coming to Wolfe for most people. Peace is very beautifully written, isn't super hard to read, and has some things you'll be able to solve, is maybe a bit weirder and a bit denser than some things, as is The Sorcerer's House, though The Sorcerer's House is very easy to read. Latcher and the Mist, or rather Soldier and the Mist, which I haven't finished, so I'm not an expert on, but is great fun and quite easy to read and has a fascinating concept. How to read Gene Wolfe. This is going to be a short section because basically I think it's quite easy. I think essentially you could say, okay, so mysteries, I need to make notes, I need to find out all the stuff that's happening. Look, this guy's famously complicated. I really need to... No, don't do that. Just read the book. I know, dog ear stuff, make notes, whatever you do, if you want to. If you're like, I really am not going to remember anything if I don't make a note. Fair enough. But I think you really have to get into Wolfe just on enjoying, in the early novels particularly, just enjoying the very luxuriant prose. In the later novels, enjoying the very dense and elusive and intense prose. I think you have to enjoy his writing. I think you should enjoy the kind of, in a lot of the books, it's quite easy to enjoy the kind of plot and the setting and the interactions between characters and things like that. And I think you should enjoy that. Just read it and enjoy it. And if you're like, I don't get it, move on. And as far as the mysteries go, certainly, and I found this with my first read of Fifth Head, yeah, enjoy it. Enjoy the mystery that you're picking up on bits of, and realise that there is so much. There's all these works by Wolfe. There's 30 something novels, loads of short stories. You've got all these places to go, and that's exciting. But in the first read, I think just in a sense, in a good sense, getting to the end, reading it at a nice pace, enjoying it, really chewing it, but just getting to the end and not worrying about having solved all the mysteries, because you will not solve the mysteries. You will then eventually have to reread them, or listen to podcasts about rereading them. So yeah, that's what I'd say in terms of Wolfe. That's where I'd say where to start and how to start. In terms of rereading, I've only reread like one Wolfe novel, so in a sense, I'm not an expert. No, two Wolfe novels, so I'm not an expert, in fact, on that side of it. But I would certainly say that's going to be an important part of it as well. But reading for the first time, I would just get through it, enjoy it, enjoy the writing. If you've got any more tips, Wolfe veterans, put them in the comments. Where to start, how to start reading. Someone out there is going to be like, I made 1,000 index cards on my first reading of Fifth Head of Cerberus, and that might be the right solution for you, so go and look for their advice in the comments. I will see you next time.